I do think that it is extraordinarily important to be able to put ourselves in that imaginative state. It's the bridge that allows us to build empathy. And so whether that is for a human who's different than us or something that is as different from us as a wood thrush or as different from us as an oyster, that ability to imagine, I think is the kind of like the gateway that opens all of our ability to feel empathy and to be in real right relationship with the more than human world.
Hey folks, thanks for tuning in to the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast. Our guest is the amazing interdisciplinary artist and environmental activist, Jenny Kendler. Many of you listening are probably familiar with Kendler's work thanks to her most recent project on Governor's Island in New York, which was reviewed and featured on the front page of the New York Times. The exhibition included 9 sculptures that use materials from the ocean itself to raise awareness about endangered marine ecosystems. In the episode, we talk about one of the pieces, Other of Pearl, which is made up of 12 oyster half-shells, where the oyster shell was grown around bio-based figures of Greek and Roman antiquities. The exhibition is really a perfect example of Kendler's work, which aims to decenter the human to make space for the full biodiversity of Earth. Some of the other pieces we discuss in this episode include Birds Watching, which inverts the gaze of bird watching using the eyes of endangered and/or threatened birds due to climate change, and Music for Elephants, which uses a player piano with ivory keys that plays music created from data on elephant poaching that is driven by the ivory trade. As a podcast that aims to examine the relationship humans have with nature and the more than human world, Jenny's work is an incredible example of how art can ask big questions about that relationship. While the conversation focuses on her artistic work, which has been shown around the world, London's Hayward Gallery, where I saw some of her work, Storm King Art Center, where I also saw some of her work in New York, the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, the MCA Chicago, and public locations, really very diverse public locations from urban river walks, remote deserts, and tropical forest. We also talk about her own relationship with nature and the more than human world. The topic being particularly relevant as she was just named an Artistic Fellow for the Center for Humans and Nature after having spent 10 years as the artist in residence with the environmental nonprofit NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council. Jenny also sits on the board for 350.org and artist residency ACRE, ACRE, and is a co-founder of Artists Commit, which is an artist-led effort to raise climate consciousness in the art world. We talk a lot about specific pieces with Jenny in this episode, so make sure to visit the podcast episode page at ecosystemmember.com/podcast or watch the episode on Spotify or YouTube to actually get to see some of the work we're discussing. Thanks to Jenny for taking time to chat very openly about her work and her background, and thanks to you, the listener, for checking out this episode. If you enjoy it, please make sure to subscribe on your preferred podcast platform. And if you're so inclined, please leave us a 5-star review. Both of these are signals to the platform that the podcast has value, and it increases its visibility to potential listeners. Without further delay, please enjoy the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast with artist and environmental activist Jenny Kendler. Today on the Ecosystem Member Podcast, we are really excited to be joined by Jenny Kendler, artist and environmental activist. Thanks for joining us today, Jenny.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So let's just start at the basics. How do you think about, feel, describe your relationship with nature and the more than human world?
So that's something that I'm always trying to really convey in my work, is the kind of level of depth and intimacy that is so compelling to me about my relationship with nature. I grew up surrounded by forests and, being a little kid out exploring in the woods. I made a graveyard for birds in my yard when I would find birds that had died and bury them. And I really think that there's something in there about this continuity for the work that I'm making now that's about us trying to both like understand and have a more intimate relationship with nature, but also think about how do we memorialize this moment that we're in. um, you know, there was this sensuousness and embeddedness about being a child in nature that I've tried to never lose and tried to like really incorporate in my practice. But also like always that sense of loss. So even when I was very young, I understood that, there were endangered species and that, the rainforest was vanishing. I remember like wanting to save my coins so I could put them into this little machine that supposedly collected money to buy rainforest, which was a really compelling idea to me. So this sense of like, I wouldn't say fragility, people say that sometimes, but I think, it's not that nature is so fragile, it's very resilient, but this kind of sense of like something fleeting or like a time of loss that we're engaged in has really been like a pervading mood in my relationship with the natural world.
And I want to ask you about that childlike nature, because I
Mm-hmm.
was just listening to your episode on To the Best of Our Knowledge, the
Mm.
kinship series they did with Center for Humans and Nature. And you talk about how one of your goals was to like connect with a squirrel so that the squirrel would sort of
Yes.
recognize you as friend, not foe. Um,
Yeah, that's funny. I forgot that I told that story. But it's really come full circle. I actually just this month was named an artistic fellow with the Center for Humans and Nature.
Amazing.
So I'll be continuing my work with them, which is really exciting because I just think that they're a think tank and a center for this very compelling dialogue around our rebuilding our kinship with the natural world. Yeah, yes, that's a true story. I climbed, I don't know how many feet in the air, 60 feet, I don't know, up a hickory tree with very thin branches while my brother sort of spotted me from the ground, which did nothing. To try to chase a squirrel in an isolated area where I thought that the squirrel wouldn't be able to get away. And then, my 7-year-old self or whatever was convinced that they would be friends with me when I got
Is
to the top. Of course, they made a death-defying leap to another tree. So,
yeah, yeah. Is that still part of how you think about your relationship? Is that still a goal, or have you kind of like moved to a different space about how you see that interaction? Maybe not with squirrels, but maybe with other non-human
um,
animals.
yeah, great. Well, yes. I mean, that was definitely a child's view of the natural world, and maybe one that was like a little bit not not anthropocentric, but like self-centered, right? In the sense that you just like understand you're sort of like thinking about yourself and your relationship in that way. But no, I mean, I would say like I don't have any sense that like wild creatures will just befriend me. At the same time, I do think there is this longing, like not only in myself, but I would say honestly in the general public to have this relationship and this closeness with the more than human world. I mean, you see this in our symbolism and all throughout our culture, right? Like, why did that Portlandia joke about put a bird on it? Like, why did that come up? It's because like people want a relationship with the more than human world. They're interested in having these kinds of wild creatures be symbols in their lives. They carry a lot of meaning for us, but we also sort of long for this kind of closeness and this touch. I think that that's probably why people find their relationships with the non-human creatures that they call their pets so compelling. And I would say like maybe a more sophisticated version of that kind of longing for closeness. I actually created a piece that's a permanent commission, a 25-foot long piece at the Chicago O'Hare Airport that literally is titled "Close to You." So it depicts the nine constellations that are named after birds, and instead of stars, the stars have been replaced by silver birds. But when you look at them, the birds don't quite look right. You realize that these are 3D scans of birds that died in window collision impacts in the city of Chicago. So my 6-year-old daughter and I went around, unfortunately, during migration season and found plenty of birds that then became part of this piece. And so the premise of this piece is thinking about how, yes, we long for a connection with nature and specifically in this case with birds, but then when birds come close to us, they often lose their lives. And so it's about that moment of collision or impact that's both metaphoric for our sort of like desire to possess the natural world. It's a little bit of a critique of how that becomes this human exceptionalist kind of sense of like desire or ownership in a way that is actually problematic or harmful to the non-human. So sure, in the case of me being a kid chasing a squirrel, that actually probably would not have been a beneficial relationship for the squirrel. So I think have tried to move past that, and see, um, again, I would say like not stewardship, because I think that that's a word that also has that still that concept of like problematic human exceptionalism, but an embeddedness in nature, that this is not like it's not about hierarchy. It's about how we actually have this like web of intimate connections.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. I was talking last week with the duo behind a project called Eyes as Big as Plates, photography.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen their work?
I don't think so, but
So
I'd like to.
they create these like wearable sculptures. It started with them talking to local elders in Norway. They're Norwegian and Finnish duo, and they started talking to local elders about their relationship with nature, and they created these wearable sculptures, and they like it's like this immersive sort of photography that they create where almost the human blends into the non-human. And I think that it kind of, when you were talking about embeddedness, I think that made a lot of sense. I was telling them when I see their work, it makes me feel like I'm getting a hug almost from nature, like because you rarely do you see that sort of intimacy, that embeddedness, in a way that's not adversarial or like human meeting non-human and creating this like moment of impact or collision.
Mm-hmm.
So that embeddedness is a really interesting part of, I think, what you're talking about there. And I think, looking at your work and including the piece you just mentioned, like your work often bridges art and science. And,
Yes.
one of your pieces, Music for Elephants, uses poaching data to create music. And then you have this other piece that was just at Governor's Island, Other of Pearl, which
Mm-hmm.
has this bio-based nylon 3D printed figure that was sort of under the shell of an oyster, like the shell grew around it. And I read that, you've had this idea for a while, like almost a decade. And it took you sort of 2 years to figure out, like with an
Mm-hmm.
oyster farmer, how it could actually come together. So when you're thinking about the things you're looking to communicate, the instances, these
Yeah.
maybe collision points that are happening, what sparks an idea for a piece? How do
Mm-hmm.
you think about then realizing it or translating that into something that is beautiful and attractive, but also in some way like informative?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I would say honestly, I could use the metaphor of the pearl oyster itself, that there's usually something that kind of lodges in my mind that becomes this like little compelling irritant. And I roll it around and around, kind of like coating it in layers until it becomes a pearl. So I think that like there's oftentimes, I'm a very research based artist. I'm reading all the time. And so there's like some kind of like compelling little fact or piece of information that it's like it feels electric to me. I sort of just like know that that's a thing that can have some kind of static electricity that will draw other ideas to it. And so I don't usually know the whole project all at once. It oftentimes takes me quite a long time to kind of accrete that. Um, you said you talked about beauty. I think that that's really important. Sometimes these initial ideas, like the idea of the bird collision, are not something that we would immediately think of as beautiful. Oftentimes there's something haunting, mournful, or disturbing about them. But I do think that for me, the idea of beauty is important because I believe very strongly in the inherent radicality of beauty. I think that in this day and age when we are um, kind of put through constantly these processes in late stage capitalism that have so much ugliness to them, there is something that like just is radical about a pursuit and presentation of beauty. Nature does this on its own, and we're very lucky that we have this ability to perceive beauty, that's something that exists within our consciousness. I think of it kind of as like an evolutionary spandrel, it's like kind of an accident of evolution. But so that's a very important component that I'm looking for. And also I really I'm looking for a narrative arc. I believe deeply in the power of story and of narrative. I think, in this moment of political crisis, perhaps we could, it's important to remember that all of us who are culture creators, so that includes you, it includes me as an artist, or philosophers, poets, dancers, we are the base engine of culture creation, right? We help to define what the Overton window is, about what the kind of like range of acceptable discourse might be. And so there's also that always in the work. It's like, how can we change the narrative? It's part of the reason why you see me looking back at myth and classical times, because that's sort of like the origin story of our Western culture. And so I want to look at, re-examine, maybe rewrite, mutate, or compost those kind of ideas into something else. And I would say there's oftentimes the other thing where I know that a project is right and is ready to be created is I'm looking at materials and material history, and kind of trying to create a material poetry where I'm looking at a sort of internal logic. This is art. It's not science. Although oftentimes I'm using a lot of information from science in the work, but it's like there has to be this kind of poetic internal logic to a piece where every part of it is considered. This is how I make my work. But everything from like the material, the exact sourcing of it, the aesthetic form, the references, they all kind of have to be shaped, I guess, again, into this kind of like single pearl.
And this idea of beauty, and you just talked about culture, and one thing that I've been thinking a lot about, you mentioned political crisis. I think yesterday they appointed a new head of the EPA who's going to take over next year, who has quite a disappointing record. And I think there's part of me that, the information's out there. We know what the science says, and yet it's not sticking with people. And it's not connecting with people in a way that is driving meaningful change. Like, do you think that's where sort of like when you create a piece of work, like the beauty plays a big role? Is like Lucia Pietro Justi, we had on our first episode of season 2, talked about sort of the durability and resilience of culture, and that these things last. And we almost kind of what you're talking about, we need to recreate these stories within this new context. And does beauty help sort of maybe potentially bridge that gap where like information itself is not enough?
Yes. I mean, I would say, I unequivocally agree with that thesis. I mean, I think that, I was artist in residence with Natural Resources Defense Council for 10 years, and we talked a lot about, what activism can do, what advocacy can do, what a scientific white paper can do, and what art can do. And they're, they operate in different ways. The beauty, for me, especially, I think a lot with my work about how beauty can be an open door to people, how it says to them that you are welcome here and invites them in. And that is a way to get people oftentimes to consider difficult or challenging subject matter. I worked for a long time also, and I still do, in direct action and political organizing around climate. Organizing protests and arrestable actions. And we had a saying in those movement spaces that we don't blame and shame. We look at systemic issues. And this is really important, I think, to my worldview in general, that I'm not interested in making people feel guilty or pointing fingers at individuals. Human exceptionalism, patriarchy, climate change are systemic issues that I would say also are all very deeply interrelated. And so when I'm talking to individuals, knowing that there's like a generic audience out there for my work, I want to be as generous to that audience as I can. And I think that beauty is really a way to say to people, you are welcome here.
And talking about that idea of beauty, I was listening to a discussion you were talking with someone about the birds watching work that you've done, which was the first work I saw of yours at Storm King in New York, and then I saw it at the Hayward Gallery in London more recently. It's quite striking. It's beautiful
Mhm.
in a lot of ways, and like the way that the light reflects off the eyes, like it has a magnetism, both from the beauty, but also from the way the light hits it. And I think I connected with it more deeply because my in-laws are ornithologists and they're big bird
Oh,
watchers. Their wedding gift to me and my wife was these. We each got a pair of really high-end binoculars. When we talk about seeing or gaze or viewing, like when you're bird watching, we're watching the birds. The birds aren't necessarily watching us. And you had on your website this piece of written work where you said, that this work reminds us that truly seeing is a reciprocal act. Um,
mhm.
so how do you think art can help people with this act of like truly seeing?
So, yeah, I'm really interested in perception. I'm really deeply invested in how we lens um, the more than human world. My background actually is in photography, so that's what I have a master's degree from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago from the photography department, which people wouldn't always know looking at my kind of extended sculptural practice. But I think you can see it particularly in this work and that idea also of like what it is to be an observer as a centrality to what it is to be an artist. In this particular case, I'm really thinking about the gaze, honestly, which is like an art historical concept as well. That informed it, and I sort of wanted to take that and bring that into a natural history context, into a ecological context, and think about what it was to have that gaze sort of like flipped back on us. So that's why the piece is not called bird watching, it's called birds watching. What I think about also is like how in any moment, when we confront the non-human world, that like we're layering both um, what that being actually is and also what they mean to us. And so I'm always trying to kind of separate or remove that layer of symbolism that we have that stops us from actually confronting. I don't confronting is too much of a fight word, but like really really being in relationship with the actual otherness that is there. And so I think that the idea of trying to break down these stereotypes is what's really important to me, so that we can see these other beings not just as a species, but as individuals too. Um,
I think it's really interesting, this idea. I mean, you just talked about it. Like, there's the
mhm,
art historical gaze, and
mhm.
there's this inversion of it, and then there's this idea of individualizing. Because I think, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the eyes that were featured was of birds that were either threatened or endangered, and that adds a whole other layer to the gaze, right?
Correct. So yeah, threatened or endangered by climate change in this particular case. And so yes, you're looking at 100 reflective eyes of birds in a 40-foot by 12-foot sculpture. They are, yes, like you said, they're reflective. They sort of return the gaze, and the piece is large enough that it kind of you know you could feel a little pinned by that gaze. You could also feel maybe like enveloped or welcomed by it. And so yeah, I wanted to talk a lot about like the different types of gazes that might exist. You mentioned bird watching, right? And so, of course, I think I thought about that with the piece and how um, I do actually want people to consider that when they're watching birds or when they're looking at the other beings in the non-human world, that gaze actually is being returned oftentimes. So, like, if you can see a bird, they can see you. And so, like, what does that experience feel like to also know that you are being observed? A dear friend of mine who also came and read one of their incredible pieces from Orion in front of work at Storm King is the amazing ornithologist, J. Drew Lanham. And it was very meaningful to me that he told me his experience of bird watching was kind of permanently shifted by seeing that work, that now he always imagines himself from the perspective of the bird as he is watching a bird. And I think that this idea of putting ourselves in the imaginative place of otherness, we've all read I mean, maybe we have or not, but we've all read the Thomas Nagel essay, his famous 1976 philosophical treatise on what it is to be, what is it like to be a bat? I say, um, if you haven't, he talks about this kind of impenetrability that we will never know what it truly is to inhabit the mind of another, whether this is a bat or I would say like another human being. Yet, I do think that it is extraordinarily important to be able to put ourselves in that imaginative state. It's the bridge that allows us to build empathy. And so whether that is for a human who's different than us or something that is as different from us as a wood thrush or as different from us as an oyster, that ability to imagine, I think is the kind of like the gateway that opens all of our ability to feel empathy and to be in real right relationship with the more than human world.
Yeah. And this is kind of gonna sound simplistic, but it just popped in my mind when we were talking about this. So like as human beings, we've decided that it's okay for us to tell children that Santa is watching and there's elf on the shelf. And yet, you've created this work about birds watching where we're flipping this like idea of us watching the birds and the birds watching us. And yet, children have to feel guilt or shame for behaving badly when the elf is on the shelf. And yet humans don't seem to have that same sort of like shame or guilt, knowing that all these, I mean, maybe not an oyster because it doesn't have an eyeball the way like a bird does, but there are definitely lots of species that can see what we're doing. Is there, I mean, I know your intention was not to create like guilt or shame necessarily, because that's part of your larger piece of work, but is there part of that where, I think I sent you, there's this quote that I read, an interview between Hans Ulrich Obrist and Gustav Metzger. And Metzger said, quite frankly, I'm not optimistic about actually affecting people's behavior, but I think people's thinking can be changed. So you talked about generating empathy. Maybe that's a better thing of like, when you create the aim of empathy, does that replace like the guilt or shame that you might otherwise generate? Like, does that allow you to come at it with a different sort of spirit? So that way, hopefully you can change how people think?
Yeah. Well, I'm laughing because I'm Jewish and I don't think I understood that elf on the shelf, which I've only like sort of heard of in passing, is about making children feel guilty or shame.
There's a Jewish version called
like
Mensch on the Bench. If you haven't come across it,
No.
one of our good friends has one. Mensch on a Bench. Same idea though. Is like there's
Okay,
something
they're
watching
like they're
you.
watching you.
Yeah.
Oh, disturbing. Yeah. Well, so I want to believe in my audience's ability to feel complex and layered emotions. So I'm not saying that people wouldn't necessarily feel a sense of shame. What I'm trying to avoid is that type of personal finger pointing, shame or guilt that I believe shuts people down. When people feel personally accused, I think that that's like a not a very generative space to be in. So I think that like my guess would be probably a lot of people feel a kind of sense of like larger shame of like the human project that is pushing these creatures off the face of planet Earth. And I think that you can feel that, you certainly can feel that simultaneously with empathy. In fact, that's, chocolate and peanut butter right there.
And I want to dig in a little bit on sort of the technical part of your work. And I think, what I've come across is like, oh, you're very intentional, like about the materials used. Like sometimes you can look at a piece of art and I feel like you can get it pretty immediately. And then there's other times when you can get it, but then when you read the placard next to it or you get the exhibition catalog, you're like, holy shit, that like is on a whole other level of I hadn't even thought about that. And like, we talked about music for elephants and it's on a player piano with ivory keys, which of course, ivory is this huge driver in elephant poaching. And then more recently, I think whale bells, each bell has a fossilized whale ear bone. Like, again, so often we're listening to the sounds of whales. Like, what would it be to kind of invert that in a way? And then there's another piece that was at Storm King Underground Library, these biochar books, sort of overlooked books from decades research and statements on climate change. So you often, what I read, you go to great lengths to secure these materials. These aren't, you can't go to like Home Depot and buy a fossilized whale bone. So like, why is the material so important in the idea you're trying to share?
Well, firstly, I'm not going to Home Depot anymore because they made massive donations to the Trump campaign. And I heard that Lowe's didn't, by the way, just a
Good to know.
factoid.
Good to know.
Um, so, yeah, the material is, this is kind of a strategy that has evolved for me over time that's become more and more important. I think it's because it's also part of the element of like history and storytelling and research in the work, because I think that these materials also have their own embedded stories that really brings something additional to the work. So in the case of music for elephants, this particular piano, it's a 1921 player piano that was made in the United States. And so that reminds us, it has ivory keys, right? That reminds us that the elephant poaching crisis, that this kind of hunger for ivory is not, nowadays people want to just point fingers at Asia and say that, that it's China, that it's Thailand or something that's responsible for the consumption of ivory. Well, in that choice of materials, there's this reminder that like, no, this was happening in the West, in our country too. And there's this sense of like, this also like these really are the tusks, the bones of murdered elephants. Like they actually are that, right? And so when the kind of like, ghostly touch of the player piano is enacted, it's also like imitating the caress of the elephants on the tusks of their deceased others, which is something that they do regularly. There's this idea of, if you've ever heard of the concept of an elephant graveyard, it's because the elephants actually like remember the family members that they've lost. Of course they do, right? And they touch the tusks of the others and they pass them around, or they did before those were taken out of the environment by human beings. So that's just like a kind of granular example of like what's important about using materials that have in and of themselves already this context, this material history that's it's about ecology and it's about human context. It's about, how we have treated the bodies of non-humans as fungible resources. In this case, with the piano piece, that's also very much true in the show that I just closed on Governor's Island, that used the kind of oyster and the whale as these two figures to tell the story of the origin story of the climate crisis as viewed through the lens of our extraction upon the bodies of non-humans. So it's a way to bring more context and more richness to the work. And there also is probably for me as an artist some element of a feeling of alchemy. I was fascinated by Ovid when I read them, early on in my 20s, and the idea of metamorphosis and transformation. But you have to have potent material to start with, right? I don't like the idea as much of having something that's kind of like anonymous or generic to work with or transform. Some of this is informed by the idea of ready-mades and how to bring real world objects into an artistic practice. That's also very true about my work, that like I'm interested in commenting on what exists in the world, but also creating something novel. So it's never abstraction. It's not quite representation either. There's this element of like surrealism, of course, in the work, and the way that surrealism talks about the world as it might be, or the world as it could be, which of course also sounds like our favorite socialist slogan about like a world, the world that could be better than the one that we have.
Yeah, I think at least what I find pretty amazing about your work is I think it creates a curiosity almost, and that relates directly to the materials and like finding out more about the idea behind it. And
Yeah.
like, it's one to generate empathy, but like, what if you could help generate curiosity so that people think about these questions more often, which I think you do really, really well.
I also think curiosity and empathy are, intensely related. I mean, I would use the example that springs to mind is thinking about I'm a single parent. I have a 6-year-old child, and something that people talk about a lot in child rearing philosophy, and also just like with dealing with conflict with human beings in general, is like how to cultivate curiosity. So rather than making statements or suggestions when you have conflict or like emotional challenge with someone, you ask questions. And so I think that, yeah, that idea of cultivating curiosity, again, it's like, that definitely borders with empathy.
And kind of bring our conversation to a close, sort of looking to the future a little bit. On season 1 of the podcast, we had a guest on, Dr. Heidi Silvestre. She's a glaciologist.
Mm-hmm.
She was kind of made famous when she was in a National Geographic show with Alex Honnold, the climber who's in Free Solo, and they went to like far reaches of Greenland to go do these science experiments. And like, honestly, like she said, sometimes you need a professional climber to be able to collect some of the data that she wanted to. And I think it's interesting because you mentioned that you 10 years as artist in residence at the NRDC. And your other pearl sculptures are being auctioned off, or maybe already have, to benefit the Billion Oyster Project. Having brought science into your work before, is the future more of this collaboration between artists and scientists to sort of bring together the beauty and the data in like a way that can maybe connect with people? Like, do we need more of that?
I certainly think that that's not the way that all artists need to be working, but that some artists should be doing that work. I mean, I think that as technology and research becomes more siloed, we were sort of like developing disciplines that are so hyper specific that they become like non-porous or like not available to a general public. And so certainly we need good science communication. I don't think I think that that should be a profession in and of itself. But I definitely think there's a role for artists, who are trying to share this kind of curiosity about the more than human world. I think that people oftentimes think of artists and scientists as being sort of dichotomous, like two different types of minds, the rational versus the irrational or something. But I think that's both way overly simplistic and, I would say, totally wrong. My parents have a background in science and medicine, so that's totally the way that I was raised. And I think that the same, we have these same kind of like inherent beliefs in a search for truth, a deep sense of curiosity, obsessiveness. So there's actually like a lot of commonalities there that I think make artists and scientists natural bedfellows. And I think that for me personally, it's a way to have a lot of like real pleasure and joy in my work. Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, right, talks about how to find your work in climate. And she talks about combining your passion with what you know how to do and what brings you joy. I think I might not be getting the Venn diagram quite correct, but joy is a really big part of it, right? And so I am a giant nerd. I love to learn new things. And I think that like to be able to be in proximity of people with specialist knowledge and, really like nuanced, sophisticated, long careers working in subject matter that I otherwise wouldn't have access to is just phenomenal as a generative potential for art making, and like really enriches my life as well. And so to be able to bring some of that into the work and share that with a public is also a thrill.
Awesome. This has been a great conversation, Jenny. Thanks so much for sharing so openly about your work and your process and some of the ideas behind it. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for the great questions, Rick. It was a pleasure to be here.